So when I say Terminator, I'm guessing you think this, or maybe this. But those are just the humanoid Terminators. There are way more. We've got dog Terminators, snowmobile Terminators, Terminators that terminate other Terminators. There's one that turns into a urinal. There's one that turns into an army of cats. Yeah, I've got a cold, I know. In this video, I'm going to look across the timelines at the endoskeleton Terminators, the infiltrators, the hybrids, the ones that are based on animals, and as many of the hunter killers as I can. So please, take a second to hit like on the video and subscribe if you're new for all kinds of weird and wonderful monster and robot stuff. And without further ado, let's do it! Terminator special for your eyeballs, let's go! And let's start with Skynet's most rudimentary rolling battle drone, the T-1 ground assault vehicle. So before Skynet became self-aware, cyber research systems couldn't perfect bipedal walking bots, so the idea of infiltration was still a faraway pipe dream. So, using patents and design from Cyberdyne Systems, they set up a machine to deliver maximum firepower and versatile maneuverability. And the best way to traverse a variety of terrains was the tried and tested tank track. The prototype design had a major vulnerability though, and left the sides open and the hydraulics exposed to attacks from the sides, as well as being quite open around the neck and arm, though that was somewhat addressed in later iterations. It already had a somewhat recognizable torso and head shape, which housed most of the optical sensors into shapes that looked a little bit like eyes, you know? It was armed with 50 cal depleted uranium Gatling guns capable of firing nearly 3,000 rounds per minute, and they were guided by an array of radar, laser, and infrared systems, as well as motion detection and heat detection. All this mounted on a platform capable of rotating 360 degrees. In Rise of the Machines, around 20 of these were purportedly reprogrammed by the TX and went on to kill every human in sight. And then in the Salvation prequel novel Cold War, an unknown number of them were deployed to guard a Terminator factory in Russia. And at this stage, it was mentioned that they were being used as Skynet's main ground force. Now, apparently in the Salvation prequel novel, there was a T4, which was just mentioned, not properly described, but is speculated to be a slightly bulkier version of the T1, but smaller than the HK tanks that we see elsewhere. We'll come back to them, don't worry about it. In Terminator Zero, an AI called Kokoro, built to fight Skynet, tried to enslave humanity by taking control of an army of assistant bots called Innos. They were pretty weak ass, but they really do remind me of pretty much every assistant bot that every company's pushing right now, which is pretty scary when you think about it. Get in the comments and let me know what you thought about Terminator Zero, by the way. I'm about 2/3 of the way through it, so I'm going to reserve judgment until the end. But Skynet's first humanoid hunter killer was the T-70, a prototype that was discontinued in 2004. An 8-foot-tall walking wall of steel, this guy was pretty primitive, his whole body serving as a mobile weapons mount for an enormous Gatling that could spray 600 rounds a minute. These guys were featured in T2 3D Battle Across Time. Then there was the T-90, which was an upgrade in terms of strength and agility. It was basically the same as the T-70. It was featured in the NES game and didn't have any weapons, it could only punch and kick and stuff. Then there was the T-300 in the Terminator 5D theme park live show. This is a pretty obscure one, it's quite hard to find imagery of it. Their face sculpt looks scarily like a gas mask. Their right arm is weld mounted with a rifle, and the sides of their torso have spinning red flashing lights for the audience to shoot as targets for points. Another from the Dawn of Fate video game was the T-400, which was designated the Clanker because they were noisy, slow, and poorly armored, which made them easy targets on the battlefield. But their cheap production footprint meant that they could be produced at a scale never before seen. Then there was the T-500, featured in Terminator Dawn of Fate. Now this wasn't quite an infiltration unit yet, but was considered a humanoid hunter killer. These were the last dedicated humanoid hunter killers deployed by Skynet before it switched to endoskeletons as its main infantry. Alright, on to the skin jobs. And the early infiltration units now, and the T-600, which went into mass production in 2016. The model that marked Skynet's intent to add infiltration to its extermination tactics. Kyle Reese said that they were simply a streamlined T-500 with rubber coverings over the titanium combat endoskeleton, and therefore fairly easy to spot. It did have a redesigned head and a working jaw though. It could lift objects almost 5 times its own weight, or punch through concrete and run at speeds of close to 50 miles an hour, if only for very short bursts. In Salvation, we see an evolution in terms of autonomy with this model, with there being 3 modes of operation. First being direct, i.e. a remote control drone that's coordinated by server, automatic, which means that it runs a pre-written set of subroutines and reactions, or autonomous, which means that it can operate independently for months on end, and even play dead to lure humans closer. Another big difference is that its main weapon isn't fixed to its arm as previous other models were, meaning that they can adapt to changing situations. Like we see one that has a grenade launcher at one point, if I remember right. The T-700 was referred to as the Dog Killer. It was mentioned in the Terminator novelization, but also in the Terminator RPG, which is like a tabletop role-playing game. It was a huge leap forward in advancement as it was the first Terminator to use living human tissue. They were initially intended for short-term infiltration missions as they could be easily caught out by their stilted mannerisms, which they would try to pass off as PTSD. They were called dog killers because of their prioritizing of killing dogs before the animal caught them out as abnormal. It's not known exactly how dogs could tell, but it could be to do with the fact that the flesh covering their bodies can't sustain itself, so starts decomposing as soon as it's applied to the endoskeleton, and becomes noticeably pongy to humans within about 10 days, so probably a lot earlier to dogs. In the Terminator Salvation timeline, it seems that these guys were built solely for battlefield combat and were entirely dependent on Skynet for coordination, and had literally zero independent thought. They were able to repair themselves though. The first truly successful infiltration unit, though, was the one, the only T-800, having one of the most powerful microprocessors ever built for a CPU in the Cyberdyne Systems neural net processor. They have learning capabilities or can be put into read-only mode. The T-800 was also 20% lighter and 40% stronger than the T-600. They are insanely robust, being able to sense injuries, repair themselves, and have a circulatory system to maintain the illusion of blood flow. They had a secondary power source if the primary failed, which in itself can last for 120 years. That is housed in an armored box in the chassis's chest that can only be penetrated by a 50 cal, maybe. Or depleted uranium rounds, also maybe. Now these guys are pretty remarkable because, mainly due to their durability and ability to learn, they've gotten the better of much more advanced models, as we will see later. Carl in Dark Fate even had a family for God knows how many years. They never noticed. They do have a few shortcomings though. They can be overbalanced, they can be overloaded with huge amounts of electricity, and will freeze and melt if exposed to freezy and melty stuff for enough time. The most famous of these will probably be Uncle Bob from T2, and the 850 variant from T3, which was powered with twin hydrogen fuel cells. I've seen these guys come in all shapes and sizes and doing all kinds of mental things, like I'm pretty sure this is a T800 spewing chemical gases out of her mouth. Might be a TX, don't quote me. Either way, the T800 is a remarkable machine. Then there was the Command variant called the T882. It was from the Terminator collectible card game all the way back in 2000, equipped with advanced capabilities for adaptability and strategic decision making, which made it perfect for serving as a general on the battlefield. It is a superior and rarely seen model. Sarah Connor Chronicles added the T-AAA, which added thigh blades. Yes, blades on the inside of its thighs, as well as a wider variety of chassis proportions, which meant it could take on a wider range of human appearances. I read that one even took the appearance of a schoolgirl at one point. They seem to take a step up in terms of durability too. This guy, Cromarty, had his head blown off by a primitive plasma weapon, and it didn't even bother him that much. He just cut off this dude's head and wore that around, and was later able to guide his body to his head and reattach it. While the Greenway Terminator could only be destroyed by being thrown into two Transformers, suffering severe electrical damage that burned out its circuitry. However, its endoskeleton was still more or less intact. Next, we've got the anti-Terminator, the T-900, which appeared in the Rise of the Machines video game. Sounds like it's pretty much a T-800 enhanced with a plasma fusion reactor and a chassis covered in a hyper-alloy armor. It can apparently turn animals against their own handlers, although fuck knows how that works. But it was the first Terminator that was used to track and kill Terminators that had been captured and reprogrammed by the Resistance. They were also seen piloting vehicles like HK tanks and call in an HK aerial weapons platform. Another better-known T-900 was Cameron in the Sarah Connor Chronicles, who was an advanced infiltrator that has software that makes itself believe that it's human, and it can be implanted with the memories of the person it's been sent to replicate. It actually has feelings, with the exception of pain. It can eat human food, it can cry, unlike the T-800, and it can check human vital signs just by touch. Its endoskeleton is made of a hyperalloy, including an element called coltan, which is a metallic ore from Africa that gives it a much higher melting point. Now, whilst Cameron was seen to be a T-AAA, the emphasis for the T-900 is definitely infiltration, so it might not be able to beat the T-AAA every time. The 950 variant has servos that enable its limbs to move in ways that human limbs just don't move. There was a 950 Terminator and a 950 Terminatrix who fought each other from Terminator 3 Fragmented, which was pretty hard to find that one. Which leads us on to the TX, an advanced endoskeleton originating from the T-900, protected by its malleable ceramic titanium armor and covered by mimetic polyalloy. You know what that is. The resultant TX is stronger and sleeker than previous Terminator models, effectively rendering them redundant. Another anti-Terminator unit, this one has the ability to be able to control other machines via a nanotechnological transjector. This is basically a drill bit that comes out of her fingertip and establishes a data connection and reprograms its code. It can control up to 4 machines at once, start and remote control cars, the T1 and even the 850. It can take stupid amounts of damage, and like the 950, its limbs can do weird shit. The neck is capable of 360-degree rotation, and the torso is capable of at least 180-degree rotation. Her tits inflate too. She got razor-sharp teeth and can snap your spine with her pinky finger. She shoots croissants out of her armpits, and every time she sings in the key of E, people brown their underwear. Yeah, I'm joking. They loaded all the options into this model is what I'm trying to say. Its liquid mimetic polyalloy, which is stored in a small reservoir in its cranium, allows for better regeneration and allowed it to assume multiple impersonations without having to return to base, unlike previous models that would have to be completely reskinned. I mean, Skynet would never do that, you know what I mean? They would just swap out the unit, but you know what I mean, right? The TX also has onboard weapons, which is something carried over from the 950 variant too, apparently. Most notably, this devastating plasma cannon, which was seen taking out small buildings and armored vehicles, and even took out a T-1000 series in a single shot in one of the comics. We'll talk about that in a bit. The TX is powered by a plasma reactor housed in its chest, which outputs more power than any other reactor produced up until this date. But even so, the plasma cannon produces a blast so powerful that the reactor's cells need a few seconds to recharge after each blast. The T-1000 and T-1002 variant was an advanced prototype made by Skynet in 2029, made entirely out of the mimetic alloy, enabling it to shift shape into anything as long as it's a similar size and doesn't have complex moving parts. Now personally, I find these limitations make it one of the best villains in movie history and add a sense of grounding and realism to everything. The tech involved in making the liquid metal to hold its shape is shrouded in secrecy, but we do know that it has a liquid molecular brain within the mimetic alloy. Basically, each tiny particle of liquid in effect has its own mini brain, which when brought together is advanced enough to give it learning abilities and even humor. When separated into smaller parts, it loses intelligence, with its priority becoming the reunification of the whole above all else. It's detailed in the Terminator 2 novel that there was a sort of cast somewhere deep in the bowels of Skynet where the mimetic alloy was poured between 2 massive plates with a cavity in the shape of a human, and it was at this stage that it was given its default molecular state. This thing is so advanced that when unified, it can make decisions based on its own logic. For example, if it disagrees with Skynet. For this reason, Skynet realized that it had the potential to turn against it and decided not to mass produce it, and later discontinued its production altogether. It's cool to the touch apparently, but is sensitive to extreme temperature, withstanding temps of up to 300 Celsius but nothing above that, and down to minus 180 degrees, but obviously nothing below that. It's also been known to be damaged by hydrochloric acid and got absolutely splooshed by the TX plasma cannon this one time, like I just mentioned. This is a prime example of how, despite all of its advancements, it's actually weaker in a physical sense than some of its predecessors, like with the T-800 withstanding much more pews without breaking a stride, whereas the T-1000 does not like a shotgun blast in the maw in the least. The T-1000 has an astonishingly long power supply and was known to have been sent back as far as 1973 and lasted until 1984, and then fought an intensive battle, no sweat. But the T-800 that went back to the same time developed issues and glitches and stuff when asked to do the same thing. I wonder if each molecule-sized mini-brain has its own power supply, and the sheer number of them means that they are easily bypassed to maintain an overall balanced power supply. I've often wondered how the T-1000 bypasses the universe's rule that only living things can be transported back in time. Remember, the T-800's living skin is enough to allow this? But after doing a bit of digging, I found that the creative supervisor of Terminator 2 Judgment Day suggested that the T-1000 could somehow mimic the magnetic field generated by a living organism, and that's how it gets around that whole thing. There's a variant called the T-1001 that could shift its shape into a slug-like shape to propel itself through water. It could also split itself into parts and operate independently of one another, which is a pretty big upgrade from the previous model, which could only really operate effectively when united into one. The T-1001 was extremely adept at terminating multiple fleeing targets with deadly efficiency. It chased down a dozen employees in a secret warehouse, extending blades to at least 10 feet to impale the escaping workers. Oh, and it could disguise itself as urinal too. Not even joking. Gave this guy a mean kiss of death by forming a tongue into a polyalloy weapon and suffocating him. Nice.
That never happened before either. Then onto the T-1002, deployed in 2032, which was basically a bot sent out to showcase the capabilities of the TX. It's able to develop stabbing weapons all across its body, which shows that it probably has greater control over the structure of its design than its predecessors, but nonetheless, the TX made pretty short work of it. The TXA was another T-1000 variant from the John Connor Chronicles books. It could implant itself into humans to take control of their minds. It could split itself into an army of cats to cover more ground, again, not joking, and adopt what's described as a Catman shape, which apparently gave it greater speed and agility and maybe one of those terrifying hooked tongues maybe. Then there's the Rev 7 from Dark Fate. So in this timeline, Skynet was called Legion, don't know why, and its entire infantry was covered in liquid alloy and was able to split itself into two as the liquid parts separated to become its own unit. These weren't, however, able to mimic human characters. The Rev 9, however, that can reshape its liquid surface to appear human, and is the most natural infiltrator ever built, with its fluid movements and mannerisms and stuff.
Its liquid shell can come off entirely, and he can become two separate bots.
Although judging by this fight scene, both of the separate bots seem pretty lightweight. Look at him getting ragdolled here.
Yoy! And here it gets bodied by the smallest female in existence.
Weirdly enough though, it is vulnerable to EMPs, whereas the T-800 isn't. Let's do the T-3000 from Genesis next.
Check out my hand, it's made of CGI. I got it from the CGI store. It was 2 for 1. I only wearing one, I forgot the other one.
Formed up of nano machines that formed when machines went nano to form a form of machines, nano, machine.
Basically, they injected machine phase matter into a bunch of human subjects. They all went Delalio, apart from John Connor, which is pretty handy because otherwise there'd be no plot. This process rewrote the entirety of their genetic makeup and made them into a zillion robo-critters, all held together by magnetism. Yes, that's right, sheer animal magnetism. Grrr!
The unit could nearly dispel itself into mist by weakening its magnetic connections.
And then it could put itself back together way the fuck over there real quick.
Even to the point of appearing to phase through solid object. It's weak to massive charges of electricity and strong magnetism due to the magnetic field that it relies on to hold itself together.
Grrr! It was eventually defeated when Pop smacked it around with his animal magnetism in these gauntlets and trapped him in the temporal time machine thing.
Then we have the T-5000, which served as an embodiment of Skynet itself.
Apparently it was from an alternate timeline and traveled back to the original timeline to infect John Connor.
Its designation indicates that it's more advanced than any predecessor, but because its appearance was so brief, not much is actually known about its abilities.
We have the T-8000 from the Transformers comic book crossover, which is what happened when Skynet reverse engineered a bunch of Cybertronian technology. They were later adapted to look more like Megatron, I guess incorporating a bunch of his technology. Then there was the T-Infinity from the comic of the same name, which was built with onboard time displacement equipment.
That's right, it had its own time machine.
It was tasked with preventing time paradoxes, with making sure the timelines didn't get all messed up and too complicated. Good luck with that.
Like the TX, it has onboard weaponry, seemingly made from some kind of a liquid metal, including plasma cannons, energy-based machine guns, blades, and a configurable energy blade capable of effortlessly cutting a T-800 and a TX in half. And it's protected by this big blue force field. The force field is powerful enough to instantly vaporize even the alloy with which the T-800s are built. In fact, just one of these guys managed to destroy 8 T-800s at a canter. EMPs have been known to stun these guys for long enough to get some damage in on them, and it was eventually destroyed by the direwolf, who ripped its head off. More on that in a minute. Just to make things even more complicated, we have hybrids. This was like Marcus Wright, who gave his body to the cause in Terminator Salvation, and had his skeleton replaced with a custom-built hyper-alloy replica skeleton, but kept key organs such as eyes, brain, yada yada bish bosh. The plan here was to use Marcus to lure John Connor into Skynet HQ so that he could be made into a hybrid too and destroy the resistance from the inside. The problem is that Skynet didn't bank on the strength of Marcus's human spirit, who won over and screwed up their plans. I'm not sure I'd call Grace from Dark Fate a Terminator hybrid, because she is just a human with some augmentation. Plus, this character was just so horribly unlikable, I think I'd rather forget it ever happened.
I can rip your throat out if you piss me off, so don't.
People evolving longer necks?
That is one long-ass neck.
There was another
hybrid and a graphic novel called Terminator Salvation: The Final Battle, where the subject used was a serial killer called Thomas Parnell, who started taking control of Skynet so that he could keep on killing. He had his own Urukai, endoskeletons and everything, so Skynet brought back markers to help take him out. So on paper, the hybrid should be the best infiltrator yet. Of course, it carries with it many human frailties, most notably emotion bullshit that it carries over from its previous life. It can also be knocked unconscious, accidentally poop itself when it thought it was just dry farting and so on. But as long as the brain is intact, it's said that a TH cannot die, simply entering a kind of hibernation. And during that hibernation, its tissue will not age or decay. Okay, so I think that about does it for the humanoid bots. Let's take a look at some of the non-humanoid ones. And let's start with animalistic ones and the TR-40, or the rat bot from the comic Terminator: The Dark Years. It was introduced in 2030 and was Skynet's attempt to set up a whole new type of infiltration network. There was also the TR-80, which was dubbed a cyberbat because not only of its ability to fly, but its sensitive hearing sensors. They also live in colonies of 100 or more units that fly in unison to cover large areas. There was the T-72 Spider Dog, armed with a plasma cannon, which can be changed to either a flamethrower or missile launcher. There were augmented SEALs, which were augmented with i950 CPUs and released to monitor for potential threats. There was the D40575 Spider Bot, more of a construction bot than a hunter killer, but fucking terrifying nonetheless. And then there was the TK90, or the Big Bad Wolf, which was designed to hunt both humans and dogs. These are not to be confused with the dire wolves, which in some panels at least is almost as big as the aerial HKs. It has a xenomorph-like tongue too. An interesting unused concept was the silverfish that was going to be used in T2, which would slither along the ground, its low profile making it hard to spot and hit with small arms fire. Once it found its target, it would quickly accelerate into it and explode, so it was a sort of a suicide drone. Something similar would appear in a comic called Terminator Salvation: Sand in the Gears, called the Sidewinder, which would deliver an electric shock from an emitter in its tail. There was whatever the Flenser was meant to be, resembling a large flying insect. It was armed with a weak laser weapon, and it would hover silently through the ruins of the future war and then swoop down on unwary victims and use its razor-sharp claws to eviscerate them. But my favorite of all of these ones based on animals would be the Hydrobot from Salvation, used to patrol water and swamps using some kind of a hidden propulsion system inside its chassis. It's a serpent-like beast with a massive steel claw for a head, and you might think they were useless on land, but they have been seen leaping large distances, and even using their large steel teeth to bite through other steel stuff. Okay, let's do flying hunter killers. And first, the smallest, an armed drone called an aerostat, or WASP, from Terminator Salvation, which are basically scouts linked to harvesters, but there's also the AA Aerodyne Fan Seeker drone, designed primarily to survey the battlefield and transmit telemetry back to Skynet. About a dozen of these could be stored in the next one, the HK Aerial, which in the original timeline had two variants, the A7 Aerial Tilt Rotor Attack Drone and the A8 Aerial Tilt Turbine Seeker Drone. They've been used to carry T-700s and spider tanks, as well as mini hunters in the Terminator 2 3D Battle Across Time. In the Transformers crossover, it's what Starscream and the Seekers adopted as their alt modes. This then evolved into the HK VTOL from the Sarah Connor Chronicles. This one was more agile with a single plasma cannon, and its engines could deliver enough thrust to allow it to carry a 747 engine. Anyway, then we have the HK Bomber. It's a 4-engine heavy assault platform, and you know the deal, more phased plasma cannons, more armor, more everything. Up from there would be the FK Carrier, but FK means that it's not a hunter killer, I guess, but it was basically the massive ship used for tactical deployments. Let's do tanks. Okay, next up we got the Centurion, a quadruped walker, nearly 20 meters tall with 2 weapon arms, one sporting a plasma cannon, the other a grenade launcher. They are often supported by spider tanks, more than double the size of an average human. And these have forward and rear facing cannons. There are several variants dubbed Demon, Chaos, Absolute Inquisitor, and Sycophant. Now for one of my favorites, the HK Tank, the size of a building, which I think might make it the largest non-humanoid hunter killer ever. Please do correct me if I'm wrong. Carrying massive firepower and heavy armor meant that they moved pretty slowly, so they also carried a small squad of T-800s to counter any resistance who might be planning to plant explosives on its outer shell. In Terminator Resistance, they have an exposed panel on their rear, and one gets reprogrammed and used by the Resistance in their final push on Skynet. A smaller predecessor version of this was the RTAV from Terminator RPG, a small track-based bot built in Perth, Australia, specifically for Australian terrain. It was back in the days of very basic levels of AI, and even though this thing was small enough to fit in the trunk of a car, it was armed with a grenade launcher and a light machine gun, so it could still pack a punch. Staying relatively small was the T-7T Pteropod, with a crab-like upper body, twin machine guns as its arms, and 4 arthropod legs. This is often accompanied with a swarm of tiny aerostats. Next up, let's talk about the Harvester, a headless walking behemoth whose job it is to scoop up squishy humies and collect them from the machines to do lab testing on their stem cells. Research that would ultimately result in the creation of the T-800. This works in tandem with the Transport, an aerial HK that buses humans to the Skynet work camps. Not only could this carry a bunch of humans and a Harvester, it could also carry other aerial HKs. Back to the Harvester though, it had a massive energy cannon on its shoulder, 2 big Chungus gorilla arms, and then 2 little baby T-Rex arms for more delicate tasks like peeling satsumas and picking up humies. Its power source gets discussed quite a bit because it's got this black smoke churning out of it, which implies diesel engine. And of course, it can also carry 2 motor Terminators, which to me stole the show in this movie. Specialized at high-speed road pursuits to run down any humans that are fleeing the Harvester, they are probably the fastest land-based Terminators. They are also capable of mind-blowing feats of agility and possess pretty heavy firepower. There's also a snow variant called the Snowminator that's been seen to be deployed in places like Alaska and obviously is more akin to a snowmobile. There was the Kraken anti-submarine vehicle, as well as a HK hydrofoil and a hovercraft, which were featured in the Terminator RPG. There was a prototype combat robot called the KZ-1 Terminator Death Valley, and finally, the T1 Bazillion, whatever this number is, T1 million, from T2 3D Battle Across Time, a gigantic fuck-off spider that protected Skynet's central core. But I think the one that I'd like to end on was the Skynet satellite from Terminator 2029. This thing could read license plates from space, but more terrifyingly than that, it served as an off-world backup, meaning that even if the entire planet was consumed by the nuclear fire, Skynet would still continue to exist. This to me is the most menacing prospect of all. If things really aren't going Skynet's way, could it just release every single nuke in existence, sit in space waiting it out, and then repopulating the planet in its own image? As I see it, unless you take this thing out, Skynet never dies. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this Terminator special. Get subscribed if you're new for all things monster and robot. Let me know if there are any other specials that you'd like to see, and I will see you very soon for the next one, which I think is a Transformers Spotlight on Prowl. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you very soon for the next one. Cheerio, bye!